Okay, so we'll go back to the PowerPoint of 13 and go through these again. And let's look at this. So increased blood pressure. Okay, increased blood pressure. So this is correct. So atrial natriuretic peptide will cause sodium to be lost. When sodium is lost, there's less water reabsorbed. These hormones, which lead to sodium retention and vasoconstriction, are these processes go on. So there's less antidiuretic hormone, there's less aldosterone. Both of those will cause an increase in sodium retention, which leads to more water. Blood pressure, there's less release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. That reduces the blood pressure. Increased water loss is going to reduce the blood volume, and we're going to return this increase. Now we're going to do just the opposite and reduce the blood pressure. So we'll go back up here, and here are these hormones. Renin is secreted by the kidneys, which is converted into angiotensin. So since 180 liters of blood goes through the kidneys every day, the kidneys has sensors in order to monitor blood pressure. So what the kidney does, it controls how many red blood cells are produced. It controls these hormones, which lead to sodium retention. So if we have this decreased blood volume, if we retain sodium and retain water, you're going to have blood pressure restored to its normal level. In this one right here, the interaction of lungs and blood vessels and so on. Okay, so if decreased pH and O2 levels, elevated levels in blood, that's going to happen. The chemoreceptors around the heart and in the aorta. So what happens when there's a disturbed pH and so on? We're going to have increased pH and O2 levels by increased cardiac output and vasoconstriction. The change in pH and oxygen levels. So if the blood vessels in the lungs, if you have increased breathing rates, that's going to reduce the amount of CO2 in the blood. It's going to increase oxygen levels. And if with more CO2, you're going to have this return to normal levels. So when you decrease CO2 in the blood, that's going to lead to higher pH. So heart function, blood vessel function, and respiratory function. Okay? It's going to return to normal levels. So let's do that again. So suppose we have decreased pH and oxygen levels and elevated CO2. So you have to remember, when the amount of CO2 goes up, the pH goes down, becomes more acid. So these changes will be sensed by these receptors, and you're going to have the heart accelerated, inhibition is reduced, centers in the brain are going to affect vasoconstriction. When that happens, when you have increased vasoconstriction, the blood pressure goes up and the cardiac output goes up. So that's going to lead for increased pH because you get rid of CO2, the pH is going to go up. So remember, CO2 plus water forms carbonic acid. If you have too much carbon dioxide, that's going to decrease pH, so it may go from 7.5 0.45 down to 7.35. If it goes much lower, that's big problems. So if you have this situation where decreased pH and O2 levels and elevated CO2, you're going to have sensing that change and using cardio acceleration, inhibiting inhibiting this center and vasomotor centers, which causes vasoconstriction. All that's going to increase blood pressure. And when blood pressure goes up and heart rate causes the respiratory centers to be stimulated, as more CO2 is eliminated, the pH goes up and oxygen goes up. So with increased breathing rate, that means more CO2 is going to be removed from the blood. As CO2 is removed, pH goes up, becomes less acidic, and increased oxygen levels occur. So that takes care of that. Okay, so let's go through this again. So we have, if blood pressure is reduced, it's going to take a process to cause the cardio inhibitory centers are going to, so if blood pressure is reduced and you're going to need that response, so you're having decreased cardiac output, and how is homeostasis restored? You're going to have more of the cardio inhibitory center, and I'm not doing a very good job in this, so let's stop this, and I'll have to think about this. I apologize. Okay, let's stop there, and we had a good, well, let's review this. So when blood is pumped into the arterial end of the capillary, the high hydrostatic pressure leaves the blood pressure higher than the osmotic pressure, so fluid moves out of the capillaries into the tissue. Here, when the hydrostatic pressure, which means the pressure due to heartbeat, is lower, so here the fluid is reabsorbed. Otherwise, you're going to get edema, and you're going to have swelling of your lower limbs and retention of fluid. Okay, we're going to have a lecture tomorrow, and I'll go through the cardiovascular system again, and then we're going to move to the respiratory, digestive, and reproductive. So I'll go through cardiac again tomorrow. Then we will look at respiration, digestion, urinary function, and reproductive function. So we have 2 more days of lectures on Wednesday and Thursday. And then we're ending the semester. So again, we'll go through this cardiovascular system right here, and we will finish up digestion, respiration, urinary function, and reproductive function. Okay, so we're going to stop recording. Stop recording. Stop recording.